Welcome to NYLA 2020 On Demand. This session was previously recorded for the NYLA 2020 virtual conference. It is available to you through December 31st, 2020. Please note, once viewed, each on-demand program is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. Links to materials and presenter contact information have been archived in a Google folder. The link to the folder can be found at the end of this recording. Any questions about the NYLA 2020 virtual conference digital platform can be directed to Christina@nyla.org, or you can call 800-252-6952. Organizing media literacy activities for prison libraries is sponsored by COURT and co-sponsored by ILRT, SRRT, and PCRT. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Drew Emanuel Berkowitz, our presenter for today.
Hello. Hopefully everyone can hear me. There we go. All right. My name is Drew Emanuel Berkowitz. I have a doctorate in pedagogy and philosophy. For the past few years, I have been doing volunteer work with New York State prisons, medium and maximum security men's prisons, to bring media literacy activities into prison library environments. Excuse me for 1 second. There we go. All right, I dropped my pen. All right, so when we talk about media literacy, and I suspect when people talk about media literacy at academic conferences, we often talk about it in the context of news media. We talk about media literacy in terms of, what reporters are doing when they are interviewing people. When people use the term fake news, that can be a media literacy term. We talk about critical media literacy, new media literacy, and as I said, frequently it has to do with the way that the events in our world are reported. But one of the aspects of media literacy that is a little bit unsung has to do with media literacy in the context of fiction. And media literacy within the context of works of literature or works of multimedia. And when that research is being done, and when that education is being done, we often do it in the context of new media, of digital media. So by that I mean, when we talk about how kids can, safely and how they can critically understand the media around them, we're often looking at what K through 12 age children and what college age children are interacting with. Now, in a library environment, that can often refer to how they are accessing information online. It can refer to when they're interacting with others on Twitter, what kind of information are they sharing and in what form. So, for example, my doctorate, when I did my doctoral dissertation, was on fan fiction, which is, as a brief explanation, it's when people online, or frequently it's an online activity, take existing stories and they change it to make it their own. And in the process of doing so, for example, they rewrite all of Harry Potter so that Harry is a girl and Hermione is a boy. And they write the whole story out, changing the genders of everyone. And in the process of doing that, they really are examining the ways that these characters are being portrayed in terms of their gender of the story. When people say the story would be so different if Harry was a girl, that's a media literacy question. It says, well, how are girls versus boys portrayed in Harry Potter? How are girls versus boys portrayed within fiction in general for children? But in the context of fan fiction, the reason why it's such an important media literacy distinction is that, and the reason why it's such a digital literacy distinction is that the participants are actually involved in, through these online websites, they're editing each other's work, they're offering peer criticism in this extracurricular activity. So that, in that sense, media literacy is examined by scholars and is talked about by teachers and librarians in terms of its digital literacy or its online potential. But it's true that we really do have a society in which things are really veering towards this multimedia and this digital literacy way of engaging in the world. But we have over 2 million people in the United States who are currently in in prisons right now. And a lot of them have been there long enough that when they get out, if they're not provided with adequate or fulfilling exercises to understand the way that media in the world has changed, the way that interacting with media has changed, then they're going to be emerging into a media landscape that's so completely different from the media landscape of the United States when they were incarcerated. So oftentimes, one of the ways that correctional facilities will try to solve the problem, try to reflect the rapidly shifting nature of U.S. society, is that they will offer continuing education classes. Some New York State correctional facilities now offer Chromebooks to some inmates as part of these classes. But one of the restrictions to that, of course, is that you can teach people technological literacy. You can teach them how to use a computer. You can teach them, how to do, things digitally, such as, well, you pay your bills online. You don't pay them through the mail these days. A lot of people, they just pay their bank bill or check their bank balance on their smartphone rather than just having to go to the bank. That's a technological literacy question. But it's oftentimes hard to reflect those aspects of media literacy, of technological literacy, with populations of students and populations of learners who don't have access to the same resources that there are in broader society. So, for example, they might be using in these correctional facility environments programs on Chromebooks that simulate the internet or give a restricted access to JSTOR, or restricted access to some online search database, but it's not the same thing as existing within the broader media landscape. So oftentimes when we talk about teaching media literacy in correctional facilities, we talk about simulating the way that media literacy exists in broader context. So if you have a correctional facility library and you have a public library, the public library will have greater access to certain things in terms of the what you can use as a resource. So like I said, sometimes what you try to do, especially if you're coming in as a volunteer, is you try to simulate certain aspects of what we traditionally use for media literacy. So one example, not in a correctional facility environment, of people doing this is a number of years ago, the National Council of Teachers of English said that rather than teaching Anne Frank, the Diary of Anne Frank, using the traditional book and saying, have everyone write a diary, simulate what would you write in your diary if you were writing a diary as Anne Frank. That's sometimes an activity that English teachers will give. It said that rather than doing that, why don't you have the kids say, well, if Anne Frank had a blog instead of a diary, how would she write it differently? So that, and there are all sorts of issues and maybe complications that result in saying, well, what if Anne Frank had a blog instead of a diary? But that's an example of a way of simulating this activity, blogging, which at the time was something that was understood to be something that children were engaged in, that teenagers were engaged in, to adapt an existing activity to try to inject an aspect of new media literacy into that activity. But the problem with that is that rather than having them start accounts on actual blogging websites, they used a program that simulated a blog. They installed on the school computer a program that simulated the act of writing a blog. But the problem with that, as you might already be thinking, is that part of the reason why social media, why blogging is such an engaging and distinct aspect that's different from just writing a diary, is that it's not just you writing the blog and people commenting on it. It's the act of being a teenager who's creating something and putting it out into the internet in a way that now everyone in the world can see. And so you introduce all sorts of different aspects to that. Now you have a teenager who's writing something and is now opening them up to bullying from people that they don't even know. You have a teenager who's writing something and they're concerned, well, my blog got 200 people reading it, my friend's blog got 1,000 people reading it, they're better at blogging than I am. That can't be simulated in an environment where the only people reading the blog are other kids in the class, because they're the only people using the program. So there are all sorts of problems with simulating media literacy. And that becomes even more important when you're talking about correctional facilities, because when you are coming in and you're doing media literacy activities, there can be some real restrictions to your pedagogies. Not a restrictions in that there's someone telling you that you can't do something, but a restriction in terms of a lot of us, we learn how to teach certain things. We learn continuing education activities. And we learn them with the assumption that we will have common resources in order to complete these activities. But in an environment like a correctional facility, sometimes there are absent resources. There's an absence of opportunity that you might not be aware of, that you might not account for. So how do you design a environment for learning media literacy without operating under the assumption that you'll have these digital media, these common media literacy tools? And I've kind of talked about this in a little bit of a roundabout way to get to this point, but really the way that I have solved this, the way that I'm going to be talking about how to solve this, is to use something that that many correctional facility libraries have access to in order to talk about an aspect of media literacy that I believe is very important. And that is the aspect of media literacy of medium, and the aspect of when we talk about how medium affects how people produce and how they receive media. The question of multimedia. So in terms, for example, in the question of multimedia, if you have someone and they're sitting down and they're reading a comic book, and in that comic book Superman dies. Now, the story expects you to feel sad because Superman has just died, and maybe it will show Lois Lane at the funeral for Superman, and everyone is sad, Batman's there, he says kind words about Superman. But at the same time that you're reading this comic book where Superman is dying, maybe there's also a Superman movie that's in theaters right now. Maybe Superman's on television. You have this multimedia character. Can you be expected to feel sad about what happens to this character in one aspect of multimedia while knowing, well, this character isn't dead on TV. This character didn't die in the movies. This character is only dead in this one facet of the character. What does it mean for that character to die anyway? And more importantly than that, how can we know that Superman as a multimedia character is a character who makes his company, makes DC Comics and Warner Brothers millions and millions of dollars a year. There's a certain level of mental gymnastics that you have to go through when you are engaging in a piece of media to put aside the idea of, well, they're not going to kill Superman, because then they're not going to be able to sell Superman napkins at Walmart. This idea of media literacy isn't just how much do you trust what you're reading. It can be how can you get emotionally involved in a piece of media while still being aware of the broader media landscape in which it's produced. And I feel that graphic novels can be a really good way to engage with people on this topic without having to use digital media technology. So to start off with, I think that I've talked around this issue a little bit more than I should, but some people may be coming in this and thinking, well, you say graphic novels, what exactly do you mean by graphic novels? Like, is a Richard Scarry book a graphic novel? It has words, it has pictures, it's telling a story. And the answer to that question is that when you look at people who write about graphic novels, who write about the academics of graphic novels, about building a graphic novel collection in their library and what should be on your graphic novel shelf in your library. Should Charlie Brown be on your graphic novel shelf in your library? Should Garfield be on your graphic novel shelf in your library? Should a graphic novel adaptation of Wuthering Heights, should that be on your graphic novel shelf? What does it mean for something to be a graphic novel? And graphic novel scholars don't really know, or haven't really been able to come to a consensus. Graphic novels, we know they can kind of range in terms of topic. A graphic novel is not a genre. So here we have, for example, we have Alan Moore's From Hell. Now, this is a graphic novel. It's a fairly serious graphic novel. It is about Jack the Ripper. And in terms of any other, a historic work of historical fiction, there's 40 pages of citations at the back of this book, explaining where the author got what historical documents the author referenced. But you're not going to find that in something like a Scrooge McDuck compilation, which was originally serialized as a bunch of comic strips, is now being sold as a graphic novel. That's a fundamentally different type of literature to some people. And this question is not by any means a new question. So here we have this Marvel graphic novel. And in fact, it's a graphic novel because they say right there that it's a Marvel graphic novel. This is from 1982. It's X-Men's God Loves, Man Kills, and it's basically just a 90 or 100 page issue of the X-Men comic book, and with no real other distinctions. It's just kind of a long comic book, and for some time there's actually an instance where Marvel didn't needed to release a Marvel graphic novel, but they didn't have one ready, so they took not this one but a different X-Men comic. They took the first 2 issues of that X-Men comic that they were going to release as individual issues, just put them together and said, now here we have a graphic novel. But it wasn't designed originally as a graphic novel, and it wasn't written to be a graphic novel. It was just marketed as a graphic novel. So when we talk about graphic novels, and when I talk about graphic novels in this presentation, one thing to think about is that we're talking about a very broad category of media works. And I think that as librarians and as educators and as volunteers, you can use that to your advantage. When you go and you say, I'm going to run a program where I have people read graphic novels. So people are going to come to that and they're going to think, okay, well, I know that Dragon Ball Z is a graphic novel. So they're going to say, well, that's exciting. I can come and I can talk with other people about Dragon Ball Z, and it's actually a very interesting topic to me. For some people, when they were a kid and they were reading the story of Dragon Ball Z, and you have Goku, who's the father, and Gohan, who's the son. And Goku has to go away and leave Gohan. Leave his son while he goes off and does what he has to do. And Gohan is basically being raised without a father. So as a child, you might read this story and you might be in the role of Gohan, of the son, who's, especially if you have an absent father. You might be reading this and you might identify with this character whose father isn't there. But if you are someone who's incarcerated in a correctional facility, and you have children who you haven't seen in years, and you wish you could be there with them, but obviously you're not identifying with the son. You're now looking at this work at this book, or maybe you remember the television show, the 300 or 400 episode soap opera that the book was adapted into. You might be thinking, well, this was a story when I was a kid that I enjoyed, but now that I'm an adult, I'm looking at it from this perspective. And you can talk about that with people. You can use this work of multimedia. Yeah, really, it's a multimedia discussion, because you notice that this is volume 11 of this. You can't, and in fact, there are dozens and dozens of volumes of Dragon Ball, but you don't have to go in as a volunteer and say, we're going to talk about Dragon Ball, and expect everyone to have read every single volume of it. Because this is, an identifiable character to a lot of people. Even if people have only seen the television show, they can engage in a discussion about something about Dragon Ball. They can engage in it as if they've read the book. You can't really do that with something else. You can't, for example, if someone has seen a movie version of Pride and Prejudice, that's a different thing than having read the book of Pride and Prejudice. The similar story. But Pride and Prejudice isn't a huge, maybe in some ways it is, but it's not this huge multimedia thing where you go and you see the Macy's Day float. There's not a Pride and Prejudice float at the Macy's Day Parade. There is a Dragon Ball float. there is a cultural awareness of this character, so you can have a literary discussion of this work. And of course, when we talk about graphic novels and a cultural awareness, the most requested work that correctional facility inmates want to talk about in terms of graphic novels is Walking Dead. Now, having a media literacy discussion about Walking Dead, especially in a correctional facility environment, can be a very rewarding experience in terms of leading a discussion. One of the most fascinating aspects of Walking Dead is that a lot of people watch the television show, and then they read the book and realize that, yes, the characters have the same names, but they feel like completely different people in ways that are very rewarding to talk about. For example, Michonne, who is the most prominent African-American woman in the story, in the television show, she is characterized much more by her violent nature than in the book. In the book, the original graphic novel focuses much more on the character's academic background, focuses much more on her moral choices. And a question that someone might raise is, okay, you have this book, and then it's made into something for television. It's made more mainstream. How did this portrayal of this African-American woman change when the story became more mainstream? We think about that sometimes as a literary criticism discussion when we think about it in terms of literature, but it also can be a media literacy discussion. When you talk about how, okay, the medium of this work has changed. The medium of the work has changed, how has its portrayal of its characters changed? What are our expectations of the characters, and how do our expectations change? So for example, Michonne in the book is much more of what we would call maybe a three-dimensional character than in the television show. But maybe the television show gets more of a pass. We can excuse the television show to a certain degree for its portrayal of this character, because we don't expect as much from the television show as we do from the book. We don't expect as much from Hollywood as we do from something we get from a book that we get from the library. And so that's an interesting media literacy conversation to have. How do our expectations change about different works? Of course, in graphic novels especially Marvel, doesn't necessarily have the greatest track record in terms of its portrayal of its characters. Characters are often very stereotypical. Sometimes comics show us the characters in the characters who aren't like the people who are writing them. And in some cases, especially in comics in the 80s and the 90s, and this is a little too short of a presentation to talk about, for example, the Comics Code and how comics were really restricted to talking about certain social issues for a while. But really, when you look at the comics, when you're working with people who are in correctional facilities, and you're working with them and talking about things that they remember, maybe the comics that they remember from when they were kids weren't really that representative, or weren't really as culturally aware as the works of literature that we talk about now. Or maybe that's kind of somewhat of a false dichotomy. After all, what do we mean when we talk about a comic versus when we talk about a graphic novel? Here we have Crisis on Infinite Earths, and this is a collection of individual comics that were put together. I like to use this work in correctional facilities because I feel that the fact that you have Superman and you have Batman and you have Wonder Woman, you have all these characters that people know, and then you tell them this is a story about Superman meets 50 other versions of Superman, Batman meets 50 other versions of Batman. You introduce this idea that actually it's not just Superman in the story. You have Superman, and then you have this other Superman, and then Superman from the 40s, and they're all different characters. That can be a gateway into talking about, well, what do we mean by I'm reading a story about Superman? Or what do I mean by this is Batman? Well, how can you tell that that's Batman? If you show this to someone and you say, that's Superman on the cover, what aspects of this character identify this as Superman? And then you might show them another picture of Superman. In the 90s, Superman wore a black costume and he had a mullet. And in the early 2000s, Superman had blue skin and shot lightning at people. But people would still look at that character and say, that's Superman. Well, what are the elements of that character that you can look at and say, this is Superman? And that can be a conversation that you can have, a media literacy conversation you can have simply by relying on just one text, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then having people talk about their past experiences with media. I'm drawn to graphic novels as a medium to talk about because there's so many different intersections between them and other aspects of popular culture. So you have a kind of hard to tell from the cover, but here we have Transformers, and we have Transformers Lost Light. Transformers Lost Light was referred to as a work that really brought a lot of the LGBTQ community into the Transformers fandom, into people who wanted to start collecting the toys. Now, why did it bring a lot of people in that community into the Transformers toy collecting community? Well, part of the reason why the Transformers toys collecting community didn't have a lot of LGBTQ people in it and didn't have a lot of women in it and was very much a kind of targeted towards a certain demographic had to do with the fact that any piece of Transformers media ultimately was trying to sell toys to boys. So in the 1980s, when they were making the Transformers movie, one of the people working on it, one of the executives said, I have a daughter who likes Transformers. How come there are no Transformers that are girls? And all of a sudden then, all of these graphic novels started having female, they called them female Autobots or female Decepticons, started having women who were Transformers. But of course, that's a problem in and of itself, because up until that point, Transformers didn't have a gender. When people ask, is this a boy Transformer or a girl Transformer? Well, they're robots from space. They're not men or women. But once you say that this one is a woman, now this one's pink and this one's a girl, this is the girl Transformer. You've gone from they don't have a gender to all of them are men except the ones that we say are women. And we'll release one toy of a girl Transformer every couple of years. That is a decision that was made for marketing purposes that then gets reflected in the literature. But of course, I've talked a lot about these multimedia graphic novels. There are a lot of graphic novels that do not have this, sometimes we call it in media literature, we call it toyetic. A toyetic piece of media is you can look at a design and you can say that's designed to sell someone an action figure. That's designed to sell a doll. Why in this book does this character have a jetpack? Well, it's so that now you'll buy the version of the action figure that has a jetpack on it. Why does he have a scuba tank in this episode? Well, now you'll buy the action figure with a scuba tank. That's a toyetic decision. But as I said earlier, graphic novels can be much more serious than that. One of the kind of the gateways into more serious graphic novels that I use in correctional facilities is the work Death Note. Now, a lot of people who are librarians have seen this book before. Maybe you've seen it in the news. There are some, the central idea of Death Note is that this character, this high school boy, has a notebook. And when he writes in it, the person whose name he writes, they die. And there are certain issues with that, of course, where there was an instance a couple years ago, and then another instance a year later or so, where some high school kid, they found he made a death note and put it in his locker, and he said what other kids does he want to die, and that of course makes this a somewhat problematic work when you talk about it with kids. You wouldn't use death notes in a high school classroom for that reason. But the theme in the story, what the character goes on to do, is he decides that he is going to reform society based on his own sense of justice. He says there are certain crimes that people should be killed for, but society just puts them in jail, or they get 2 years for a crime that he thinks they should have been killed for. So he decides that he's going to watch the news, and if there's someone he thinks didn't get a severe enough punishment from the criminal justice system, he's going to kill them. He's going to basically become the god of justice. And that's a really interesting story to read when you are in prison. This idea that there's this person who believes that the justice system is not strict enough, or that he can pick and choose how punishment works in society, that he doesn't want to follow the rules of society, but he wants other people to follow his rules. There's a lot that you can talk about thematically, in addition to talking about media literacy in this work. Now, of course, that's a work of fiction. You might be thinking, well, I actually want to do works that are more, more talking about broader social issues. And that's interesting to talk about issues of justice, but there are a lot of people who really don't want to read books about things that aren't real, especially in correctional facilities. A lot of people go to correctional facility libraries because they want to understand more about the world around them. And I have a series of works that I often use to talk about broader aspects of society and how media represents aspects of society and cultural issues. A good as anyone to start with that is very pertinent, even more pertinent now than it has been in past years, is Representative John Lewis's trilogy of graphic novels, March, which is about the aspects of the civil rights movement and about Selma and certain elements of the civil rights movement that we don't talk about very much in K through 12 schools. Some of the less pretty aspects of the civil rights movement, to maybe simplify things, but it's John Lewis's personal experiences with the civil rights movement that he of course was involved in, and it is a good topic to talk about because it represents incarceration and represents civil disobedience. Reading about people who are incarcerated because they're doing something noble, when you are incarcerated yourself, it makes it a very different experience reading it, and a different experience to talk with people who are incarcerated, who are reading this work about civil disobedience. Now, I also have other works that are talked about. Of course, Mouse, which is a work about, so Mouse, for those who don't know or who are shocked by the cover because they don't know what this work is about, this book is written by the son of a Holocaust survivor, and it is a version of his father's life, but replacing it replaces all the Nazis with cats and replaces all the Jews in the Holocaust with mice, and it kind of creates almost like a Disney version. That's oversimplified, but this was, a lot of people talk about how this book makes a story about people being persecuted and people being oppressed into a story that is more about a universal human experience, because you aren't looking at people, you are looking at animals, and animals doing these horrible things to each other. And when I talk about March, I mean, not to sugarcoat things, but when you are sometimes when you are in correctional facility environments, the topic of the Holocaust and the topic of the oppression of Jews is a little bit of a touchy subject within certain, we know that there are a lot of extreme views within correctional facilities, and it is a easier topic to approach when you are reading it in a cartoon form. And then, of course, the question is, well, why is this easier to talk about when I'm looking at it as a cartoon than to just talk about what happened? Why do people need these to be cartoon characters to talk about the Holocaust? And that opens up to more media literacy discussion with people, especially once you start going to other areas of the world. So Persepolis, another widely acclaimed graphic novel, concerns the Iranian Revolution and is written by a young girl who was growing up. She started growing up when Iran was much more progressive than it was today, and then had to go through puberty at the same time that Iran was going through all these problems. And not only is it a story that is not often discussed within popular media, but for many people in correctional facilities, they often, or many people in society just in general, adult men tend not to read stories written by women about their experiences as teenagers. You know, you would not be surprised if you are doing a discussion group with people in correctional facilities. You shouldn't be surprised if people say things like, "This is the first book that I've read that was written by about a teenage girl, by it from her perspective." It brings people out of their comfort zone, especially so they go from March, which is about, for a lot of people who are inmates, they were, you know, children, or they were even teenagers at the time that all of this was going on, that civil rights movement was going on. Mouse is a little further removed, but we talk about the Holocaust. It's a subject that is brought up in popular culture more than the Iranian Revolution. Part of the purpose of media literacy is to bring people out of their, not out of their comfort zones, but to get them to talk more about things that they might not be thinking about with media. To that end, one of the most recent additions to the works that I use in correctional facilities is They Called Us Enemy. So George Takei, who a lot of people would know from the television show Star Trek, he himself grew up in one of the US's internment camps of Japanese Americans during World War II. It's not the sort of story that we talk about a lot in America. But you can see how starting with March, then going to Mouse, and then to Persepolis, and then to They Called Us Enemy, you are getting people to talk about issues that they might not have even thought that they wanted to talk about. You know, think about, okay, I've read these 4 works. What common elements are there, but what's different about these people's experiences, and how are they presented differently? March, for example, is much more photorealistic than Mouse is. I mean, it would have to be, considering that everyone in Mouse is a cartoon character, a cartoon animal. Persepolis has more of an idyllic style to it. You know, why do these different works have different visual presentations? Now, as we approach closer to the end of me talking about of working in correctional facilities, one of the things that some people might be hearing this and think this is a great idea. You know what? How can I get involved in correctional facilities? How can I volunteer in correctional facilities as a librarian? Well, the easiest answer to that is you can. It's very easy, and people who work in correctional facilities, as correctional facility libraries, are very excited to have people come in to run programs. You know, to people who are in correctional facilities as inmates want to talk about things. Often the library can be seen as a space where you get to talk about things that you don't get to talk about when you're anywhere else in a correctional facility. The idea that a library is not where you just go to get a book or to read a book, but where you go to talk about things that you read in books, and talk about how the books that you read make you feel about society or about your life, or about, you know, if you read Dragon Ball and you say, I really identify with the dad. When I was a kid, I really identified with the son, and I wish I had understood the dad's perspective more. You know, now you're talking about yourself. You're talking about experiences. You're not talking about this character who goes and fights aliens and blows up planets. You're talking about father and son relationships. And maybe that's the only time that you get to talk to someone about something that deep while you're in a correctional facility. Maybe maybe your cellmate or maybe your friends there just don't want to talk about stuff like that. Shaping the library as a space for intellectualism, shaping as a space for conversation, is a real important part about doing volunteer work in correctional facility libraries. And with that said, a lot of people, I feel, sometimes when people want to get involved in correctional facilities, there's a tendency to have a very, I don't want to say activist motivation, but to say that, you know, the idea that you're going to go in and you're going to change all sorts of things and you're going to really impact people's lives for the better, which you are. But one thing to keep in mind, I would say the 2 most important things to keep in mind with going into correctional facilities and doing volunteer work with correctional facility libraries is, first, it's much safer and much less dangerous to go into a correctional facility than anyone would think. I mean, you see prisons on television, and you think that you're going to go in and you're going to feel unsafe. But I don't think there's ever a place in the United States where there is more surveillance than in a correctional facility. You are safer as a volunteer in a correctional facility than you probably are just walking down the street in some sense. You know, it's not like you're going to feel like you're in danger. And I think a lot of people don't go volunteer in correctional facilities because they're scared, and there's really no reason to be. The second thing is that sense of safety comes with a caveat, which is that correctional facilities are also the most rigidly structured spaces that you may have ever been in. And they, not to say that it's draconian or anything like that, but the idea is that there are certain things that you need to be flexible about. So, for example, just oftentimes when I want to bring up a topic of discussion, say I want to do Contract with God. Contract with God is often thought to be the first English language graphic novel. It's by Will Eisner. The awards for graphic novels every year are called the Eisner Awards, to give you an example of how important this work would be. But that said, even though it's been around for so long, there just aren't enough copies to make sure that everyone who comes to your discussion at a correctional facility would be able to read the book beforehand. It's not widely distributed. Similarly, A Silent Voice is a great work. It's short compared to a lot of other Japanese graphic novels, which, for example, One Piece is the most popular Japanese manga in the world, and it's approaching 100 volumes. You're not going to be able to discuss that with people. No matter how many copies a correctional facility has access to of that, someone's not going to be able to read all of them. They're not going to be able to read all of them in order. So this, I thought, might be a good topic of discussion. A Silent Voice is about a romance between a girl who is deaf and the boy who, when they were in elementary school, bullied her for being deaf. And it's about how can he expect to feel like he is worthy of her affection when he did such awful things to her. And it's it's a kind of a typical teenage romance in a lot of ways, but it's also Japanese graphic novels are interesting, especially Japanese romance graphic novels, because unlike in the United States, there are just as many romantic comedies and romantic dramas in Japan for men as there are for women. So it's interesting to people say, well, I don't want to read a romance novel. Those are for women. I'm a man. That we have a very gendered idea of genre sometimes. And even putting aside how valid that is, this is a genre that is for men in Japan. So it's interesting. That's an interesting media literacy discussion. Well, here's this genre that you thought you weren't going to be interested in, and now you are. Well, why aren't you? What's different about this that makes it makes you want to read this, but you don't want to read a American romance novel, a typical, what you would think of as a typical romance novel. Are they that different? Is it just that this one is marketed to men that makes you want to read it? That's a interesting media literacy question to talk about. But problem with that is that it's too new. Some correctional facilities, especially in New York, have access to public library resources, but they may not have the same level of access that you're used to, especially if you're a public librarian. I'd love to do a work like the Cowboy Wally show, which really is about how America kind of idolizes obnoxious television performers, which I think that we can kind of maybe relate a little bit to modern American life, of how we see things that are obnoxious or disruptive, and we elevate them to kind of a paragon to aspire to, and really that's that really creates a lot of problems. But the problem is that this is another work that you're not going to be able to expect them to have 2 copies, let alone 12 or something like that. I like to joke that if there's something that you had to spend years trying to find on eBay, you're not going to be able to talk about it ever in a correctional facility. But that said, I had said that you have to be flexible. And what I mean by that is that correctional facilities have correctional facilities have content guidelines. First of all, when you choose a book, you're not going to be going in and bringing in 10 copies of a book and giving them to people. You know, the correctional librarian is going to be pre-approving books. They're going to be the ones who gather the books, you know, who obtain the books, and they're going to be the ones who distribute it. It's not like you're bringing in books and you're going to give them to people. It's not like you're bringing in handouts and you're going to give them to people. There's not anything that's going to be changing hands between you and people in there. And part of that is because they're very strict, especially with graphic novels, there are very strict guidelines for what can be visually shown. You might think, well, they have all these books in correctional facilities that have, you know, they have violence in them or they have sex scenes in them, but they're not visual. The visual component is very important. And to use a kind of extreme but a very real example, here we have Sailor Moon. And Sailor Moon, one of the things Sailor Moon is known for, if it's known at all, is that it's made for, you know, it's basically made for elementary school age Japanese girls. And of course, there are adult Americans who enjoy the series, but originally it's made for children. But here we have this cover, and we have a 14-year-old girl on the cover who's in bed with her boyfriend. That's probably not going to be allowed in a correctional facility. Similarly, A Maidens in Your Savage Season, if this was a book, then it would just kind of be like, it's content-wise, it's very similar to something like Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, or another book written for preteen girls. But the fact that these issues are being shown rather than being talked about. When you're talking about sexuality and pubescence of girls is very different when there's pictures accompanying it. So even though this is kind of a steadily growing in popularity as a work of young adult literature, and it's for young adults, there's different standards in different places. You know, different correctional facilities will certainly have different standards, especially, you know, not to be blunt, but some correctional facilities have people in the correctional facilities who probably shouldn't be, you know, be given this kind of material, and just due to the nature of why they're in the correctional facility. But you would think with content guidelines there would be you would say, okay, there's content guidelines. There are things you're allowed to do and there are things you're not allowed to do, right? But it's not as simple. So Watchmen, for those who don't know, Watchmen is the only graphic novel that made it on Time Magazine's top 100 novels of the 20th century. So among people who are interested in graphic novels, it's considered to be like, well, you want to read graphic novels, you should start with this one because it's so famous and so changed the medium so much. And we wouldn't have things like Dark Knight Returns or the Batman movies or you know, the Marvel movies without something like Watchmen. But it has a scene where there's a prison riot in it, a very violent prison break. That's not going to be allowed in a correctional facility, probably. But on the other hand, Walking Dead has a lot of violent scenes within prisons in it too. You know, they hole up in a correctional facility and fight off the zombies, and there's a lot of fighting in the correctional facility and thinking about how you can use the correctional facility to your advantage to fight people. But correctional facilities have a lot of copies of that book. They have access to that. Now, the response to that is not to say, well, is not to point out the inconsistencies. Because when you're in an environment like a correctional facility as a volunteer, you're not going to get anywhere by saying, well, you can use this book, but not that book. Why is that? What the most helpful way of responding to that is thinking, well, great, I can use Walking Dead. You know, I didn't think I was going to be able to, but I am. So it's not like you can see that they're using Walking Dead and not Watchmen and use that to leverage being able to use Watchmen. You are very much, you know, you are a guest in a correctional facility. You're a volunteer, and as sometimes I like to say, you know, you go and there might be something that happens, and you know, when you leave to go to the correctional facility to volunteer, the rules about a certain aspect of correctional facility policy might change during the time that you're in the car, and you get to the gate and it's well, we've added something to the list. You can't have this in your pocket now when you go in for check-in. And really, you kind of have to just be flexible, because you can't have that in your pocket. You know, they decided that this is the new rule, and you're not going to be able to get in and volunteer and help people if you don't follow that rule. So what I'm really trying to stress is that it's a lot. Volunteering in correctional facilities is something that people definitely should do, and it's definitely safe, but it's important to be flexible, and it's important to work, especially working with and talking with the correctional facility librarian that you're volunteering with, asking them, how can I make this process easier? What can I do? You know, what works do you recommend? I mean, obviously you would think that would be a go-to thing, is working with the person you're volunteering with, but there, you know, sometimes you might come in with an idea that this is how I'm going to teach media literacy. But as I said at the beginning, you know, there are some environments where the way that you have been teaching things in a certain way, you've been teaching media literacy like this, you know, and you've been using digital media to teach it. But now that you're in this new environment, you're volunteering in this environment, there's a different set of requirements. In one previous presentation I gave on this topic, I thought about titling that presentation "Overcoming Obstacles to Media Literacy." But it's not obstacles in the same way, it's just the set of tools that you have in a correctional facility are very different. So to accomplish the pedagogical goals that you want to accomplish, you might want to think about things like graphic novels. Maybe you haven't ever used graphic novels. Maybe you haven't ever read graphic novels, or it's not a medium that you really have explored before. But it's worthwhile to think about it as an interesting way to present ideas to people, to start discussions, to engage people in a literary stimulus-based discussion, and to open up the dialogue from there. And I think that we are nearing close to. I don't know if a moderator is going to come in and tell me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Drew. Yeah, you can. That was great. Thank you so much.
I want to make sure we have time for questions and everything.
Yeah, if we have any questions, people feel free. This is a pre-recorded presentation. We do have people attending live, so if you have any questions, you can just pop them into the question tabs, and Drew can answer your questions. While we're waiting for that, Drew, I heard you mentioned earlier you have a book coming out this fall.
Yes, I do. So one of the things that I focus on academically is I look a lot. I mean, obviously, correctional facilities are not what you would think of as a traditional learning environment, but non-traditional learning environments and non-traditional forms of literacy tend to be the type of education and the type of learning that I focus on the most. And one of the things that I've been exploring is how people learn about educational issues, about pertinent social issues in different ways. So this fall, I have a work coming out, and I'm going to share this using the screen share. I have let's see, show just a window. There we go. That should be sharing. I have a work coming out, Framing School Violence and Bullying in Young Adult Manga. It's coming out through Palgrave Macmillan in a couple months. I believe it's October or November. I should know this, but it's coming out. It's coming out this fall, and this is looking at a particular form of graphic novels, which are Japanese graphic novels translated into English, and then marketed towards young adults in international markets. Not only English, but they're very big in France, and they're big in England, and starting to become very big in China. So it's very much an international literary phenomenon. What makes them very different from other forms of young adult literature is they're very frequently set in schools, in K through 12 schools, and they're also very frequently much more violent than you would expect young adult literature to be. And so through this book, I'm looking at how school violence and bullying is portrayed within this form of literature. And if that interests you, you can check it out. It's somewhat different from what we're talking about today, but if you are interested in graphic novels, it might be worth looking at.
Great. We'll be sure to put a link to Drew's book in the Google folder that you can reach after this program. I have two questions for you, Drew. Do you talk about Archie comics and Riverdale? What do you think of those changes?
So it's interesting because I feel that Archie comics really strives to become, having looked at it over the past few decades, there have been many periods of time where Archie comics has really strived to make itself more, well, the whole comic industry, I should preface this by saying Marvel and DC, the two big American comic publishers, at some point decided that they really wanted to focus much more on adults than focus on children. And that kind of, a rising tide sort of lifts all boats in a sense, because that forced a lot of the other US comic industry to have a more adult, more mature, more socially, talking more about social issues or marketing more in a more adult way to their readers. And that was a real problem for Archie Comics, because one of the main things they're known for is their kid-friendly atmosphere, their kid-friendly tone. So at various different times in Archie Comics' history, they've tried to become more of a adult story. And with Riverdale, with the show, kind of making, for those who don't know, Riverdale is a little bit more, if you think of something like Twin Peaks, Riverdale, and how the atmosphere of Twin Peaks is very tense to it. Not the supernatural component, but the idea that there's just kind of everything, all the niceties are just kind of a veneer over all of these social ills. Riverdale is a transformation of the Archie story to that sort of atmosphere, and I find when I look at it, I feel like the show accomplishes that very well, although it does have certain issues to it. But I find that can often work much better when you're adapting something than when you have it. It works better to say this is an Archie television show that changes Archie in this way than to change Archie the comic itself. I find that Archie tends to have these changes. There was a period of time, for example, where they did something called Archie's Married Life, and it was they would release it, and it was Archie as an adult, and the first half of every issue was Archie and his life with Betty, and they got married, and the second half of every issue is in this other alternate universe, Archie and his life with Veronica, and they got married. And there was a period of time where that was very popular with Archie, and then it kind of went back for a little bit to how it was before. And then there was a period of time where I think they did Archie Meets the Punisher from Marvel at one point, and that was, now Archie's experimenting and becoming more adult. I find that Archie kind of gets into the cycle where they experiment more with maturity, with not that there isn't a sophistication to Archie stories, because obviously there is a formula that it uses that is very, very successful, but trying to make it more of something for, more like Riverdale, I guess, to put it. I find that that's very cyclical. So while I like the changes that they're doing in Archie Comics, I feel like maybe the best way, for those who don't know, graphic novels, a lot of people think the graphic novels, that comics in general, are just a Marvel or a comic book type of thing. But actually, the biggest graphic novel publisher in America is Scholastic. That Scholastic sells way more graphic novels, on an order of magnitude, more graphic novels than any other publisher. And it's because Scholastic is targeting preteen and teenage kids. They do it at book fairs. They have a lot more books that star women. There was I think that it was either them or Boom Studios, where they had a very successful Babysitter's Club adaptation, where they took Babysitter's Club and they made it into graphic novels. And it turned out that there were a lot of people who wanted to read a Babysitter's Club graphic novel. When the television show She-Ra on Netflix, the new version, the people who worked on that were some of the people who were part of this new wave of this kind of, this scholastic-led wave of graphic novels. And I often feel like Archie might do better and reach more of the people who might enjoy Archie if they target more of that scholastic audience than target more of the people who are reading the Marvel and DC comics. And I guess that was a long-winded answer to it, but it is something that I feel like I've thought about quite a bit. So I'm glad that you asked it, and obviously I've thought about it quite a bit because I kind of rambled on about it. But it is I think that Archie is a little indicative of the way the graphic novel industry is going, where they're just trying to experiment and see what works.
Great, thank you, Drew. We have one last question, and it's kind of on that note with Scholastic. Hi, Drew. Do you have suggestions for titles that are for people who are hesitant to read graphic novels because they consider them childish? We all know that's not true. And also don't want anything to read about history.
So there are a couple of things that you can work with. If you're interested in expanding into something that is like, if you're looking at something that's Japanese, obviously Japanese manga has a lot of adult-oriented titles, and in fact, in Japan, I think more adults. It's probably not more, but almost as many adults read comics in Japan as children do. So they have a lot of, that leads to a lot of interesting situations where they have they'll have a financial magazine and it'll have a comic in it about a middle manager, and then he gets promoted and they change the title, now he's upper middle manager, whatever. And so they have a lot more titles aimed at adults. I think that some of those don't necessarily make it over to America. I would say that if you're interested in something that doesn't have to do with history in that regard, that if you're looking at something and you're interested in maybe doing something that is Japanese, I would recommend. I'm gonna just go behind me. So there is the work by Clamp. It's called Clover. I have right here. This is the Dark Horse version, but I believe there's a new version coming out later this year. It's the same book, but it's just Japanese books sometimes change publishers when they go to America, and then they swap them with each other. But Clover is written by a artist collective of 4 Japanese women who have been writing since the 80s, and it is very lyrical and very stylized. And I would say that it really, I think that teenagers could read it, but I feel that it probably appeals much more towards adult readers. But I know a lot of people, they look at the Japanese art style and they want something that's a little bit more familiar to them, because Japanese art style can be, it definitely, there is no one Japanese manga art style, but there's a lot of people who are put off by it. And I would say that something like, well, let me see. If you're looking for something that isn't like a superhero-y type of thing, something that doesn't feel like a kid's work, then I would say that looking at maybe, in fact, I actually just had it pulled out. So there is, you know what? Just give me 1 second, and I'm gonna grab it. So there's a series of French graphic novels that are called Valerian and Laureline. And there was a movie, you can see these are very thin. They don't take very long. French graphic novels tend to be much shorter than other countries. They were made into a movie last year or 2 years ago that really didn't have much to do with it. But if you might look at it and you would say this kind of looks a little bit like maybe a French version of Star Wars. And the reason for that is that back when, these are from the 70s, and back when no one really knew about this series, a lot of the costume designers for the first Star Wars movie basically just took part and parcel a lot of the costumes from this and made them. So for Darth Vader's helmet was originally from this. A lot of the aliens originally were from this. But it's a very interesting, almost idyllic science fiction story where they're going it's kind of trotting around. Like, if you're interested in something like Doctor Who, maybe that would be a good comparison. I think that's a good work to start with. And maybe you would start with one of the earlier volumes. There are a lot of them at this point. I mean, just looking at the back here, they show a lot of different pictures of it, but a lot of them are pretty self-contained. So that might be a good thing to look at. And a lot of people talk about Watchmen as a good entry point into graphic novels, but I actually have started recently to feel that isn't necessarily a good recommendation, because so much of it relies, so much of this work, even though it is good, relies on you knowing a lot about superhero comics, because a lot of the interesting things that it does are subversions of superhero comics. So I know a lot of people would instinctually go to this, and I think that if someone wanted to read a more adult version of a graphic novel that wasn't historical, and someone recommended Watchmen, if they didn't like superheroes, they would have somewhat of a bad time reading that. So I guess that's two suggestions and one opposite of
suggestion. Great, thank you so much, Drew.
Well, thank you.
So this concludes the NYLA 2020 on-demand program, organizing media literacy activities for prison libraries. We hope you continue to take advantage of all the on-demand and live programs the NYLA 2020 annual virtual conference has to offer. Thank you for helping us make this the best virtual conference ever.